Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the I Measure You Research Review. I'm flying solo today as James away, but I'm joined by Matt Whalan. Matt, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it's a little bit later in the day for you over in Australia. It would be great if you could just start off by telling us a little bit more about who you are and what you do, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks Dan for inviting me to be on, and it's always nice when people read your own research, I guess. So my background is I'm a physiotherapist over here in Australia. I did exercise science as an undergraduate, and then did a master's of physiotherapy after that. And then over the last 16 years worked in private clinic over here. My own clinic. I've been as a partner for the last 15 years and worked in rugby league, in cricket, football, soccer, a bit of AFL, a bit of rugby union. So right across a lot of the different sporting codes, I guess. And more recently started working in the national team sort of environment with the Joeys, the under-17s national team, and in men's and in women's, and also under 20s and the young Socceroos as well, so, and young Matildas. So sort of across, probably sitting more now in the football space. And then about 7 years ago, I went to a conference in the ISO Connect conference in London, and came up with a great idea to do some research around trying to prevent injuries and going with the lofty ambition of trying to reduce and stop everybody getting any injury that ever happens in football. So that was the goal. And I haven't achieved that, and I've now realised why I won't. So that's probably a good place to end the intro.
Yeah. No, we were talking just a moment ago off camera about kind of the work you do with your soccer team. So obviously you have a lot on your plate from a practical perspective with your private clinic, and obviously working with the national team. So why did you ultimately decide to undertake a PhD? What was it within you that kind of drove you to say, look, I need to get back into research and move forward in that respect?
Yeah, I think a lot of it probably came from my work in rugby league a little bit, where I felt as a physiotherapist we almost became panel beaters. So we were putting players on the park to get them back out. And then they just hurt themselves again. And then I moved across back to football, which is where I grew up playing football. And I felt that we had a lot more of a chance to have an impact beyond just once the player was injured. So then I went to the conference, and as embarrassing it is to say, 2013, I still hadn't heard of the FIFA 11 Plus, which it was called at that stage. And then there was these brilliant presentations by Jerry Dvorak, and I think Mario Bazzini was around there as well, and Holly Silvers, Granella was there talking about this 40% reduction of this simple warm-up program. I thought, this is brilliant. I'm going to start this, and on that trip, I actually managed to. I was very fortunate. One of the players at the Wollongong Wolves, who I worked with as well, he had worked with Alan McCall when he played in the A-League, and he hooked me up with Alan when Alan was still at Lille in France, and Alan was very gracious with his time and spent the day, let me come into training camps and the training centre. And it was really interesting just to see that you think that it's all whiz-bang, really important, fancy gadgets, but a lot of it was really simple things, attention to detail, things that don't cost anything apart from effort. And I came back from that trip, and the club I work at, we don't have a lot of money. So we started to put some systems in place, and it sort of all just went from there. So we looked at, I partnered with a university that's local to the University of Wollongong, who had an exercise science program, and we established an intern program for undergraduate students. So these are students that needed their hours, and it became a win-win scenario where we could create a really applied, real-world scenario for them that they got really good experience within the industry, and then we got resources and they were supervised. So that model then worked really well at that one club, and we sort of started thinking, well, can we make this grow? And working with the university, started to shape it across multiple clubs. And the region I live in, we've got 15,000 footballers, and lots of clubs. So we sort of spread it across that, and it kind of it grew from that. So it was almost accidental, the research avenue, but it was more probably looking for something beyond just treating an injured player and starting to get to a point where maybe we can be really impactful around stopping players getting injured in the first place.
Nice, that's really cool. In your opinion, how important is that university collaboration, particularly for the smaller clubs with tighter budgets? Is that really kind of proved fruitful for you guys?
Oh, it's been fantastic. We've had 5 different side projects that have run parallel to my own research, well, my thesis, I guess, which was the injury prevention sort of work. But and some of it came around to get access to GPS units, for instance. Like, we had no chance of buying GPS units, but the university had the old Catapult S4 units. They had I think 25 GPS units, and so we designed a project that gave us access to the GPS unit. So it didn't cost us anything. It just cost me all my head of hair. But we ended up getting to the point where we were able to actually get some really interesting data around what sub-elite players actually do workload-wise. So our players who sort of MPL, which is like pretty much tiered, or they'd be tier 2. They're semi-pros, but they train 3 nights a week. They play on the weekend. But they were doing distances in matches the same as an A-League player in total distance and also in high-speed meters. They were doing half as much as an EPL player, but so was the A-League. So we've got, the long and short of it was, we were trying to prepare players to play at the same level as a professional player, but these players are laying bricks during the week, and our training sessions probably weren't as intense enough to prepare them for that. So that kind of started our shifting into like a gym-based off-season program. So we really started to work a lot on high-intensity interval training. A lot of it in a weird way, and hopefully none will listen to this, we kind of tricked the players, because often their contracts didn't start to the first week of January, but because they weren't on the field, they thought they were just in the gym from November. So we had 6 weeks of really hard work and used the heat to really create some really nice overloads, and we were pretty nasty to the players. But the idea is that's the hardest, really physically, they're going to work the whole season in theory, and the whole crux of it is to make them really robust players that, if during the season, and this is some real world scenarios where we've had where like a player who's a management level as a teacher has parent teaching, he has to miss 2 training sessions because that's his job. He's not having a massive drop in it because his base load is so high. So, and we've found that really useful and very effective. And COVID, I know we just spoke about it off camera, like COVID's really highlighted how important that is for us, because that lockdown of 8 to 12 weeks really lowered our floor, I guess, of what our base load of what the players can tolerate. So we've had a lot more injuries compared to the last 3 or 4 seasons where we've really implemented this. So it's not a nice way to do it, but it's a really interesting way to justify why we keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I wanted to dive into your most recent publication from your PhD. So first and foremost, congratulations on becoming a doctor.
Thank you.
But yeah, obviously I reached out to you a while ago after reading your paper, which was titled "Do Niggles Matter?" So it'd be really great to dive into that specific paper in a little bit more detail. I guess we can start by going over how it came about. What made you kind of look into niggles in the first place?
Yeah, that was another one from a conference. So after the Isokinetic conference in 2013, I thought this was all pretty cool. There's a whole 2,000 people talking about football injuries. So then the IOC injury prevention conference was in Monaco the year later, and I thought I'm going to go to that one. And Ben Clarkson was there presenting his work through Oslo Sports Trauma Research Centre, looking at this overuse type of questionnaire. And I came back from the conference, and we'd already started the framework based on the Van Mechelen model of like injury surveillance. And some of the work that Roel Barr and Ben and others, of course, were raising is that we're not capturing injuries outside of the time loss injuries. So because of that great survey, we sort of dug into that, and we used the Oslo the questionnaire on health problems, which was more, I think, born out of their use within the Norwegian Olympic team. And that suited us really well in terms of capturing those non-time loss components. And to be honest, we didn't have a budget, so we just ran it through SurveyMonkey. So every week I sent out all those surveys. And we ran it concurrently to the traditional consensus method, where looking mainly at time loss injuries. So we modified it a little bit just so that the players had the option to, if they reported that they had a physical complaint, they then had the options of the locations were the same as the consensus statement. So when we got to analysing the data and the looking at any association, we could have it. We're comparing apples to apples a bit. So it was really good timing, I guess. And then I was very fortunate through my whole PhD. My supervisors were brilliant, so they were really open to being adaptable. There's a lot of enthusiasm for doing something pretty novel, which was really cool.
So what were the main objectives of that research, Matt? What did you hypothesize you would find from using this questionnaire?
Good question. So essentially, we're looking at because as I suppose as a clinician, and a lot of the research came from questions that we found as clinicians, was that we see a lot more. To me, when we look at the epidemiological papers, or we're finding I see a lot more than what gets reported in some of these studies. So I expected to see probably more injuries than are recorded in the traditional time loss methods, which is what we did find. Almost 2.5 times more injuries actually occur. And the interesting part, especially with this method, is you can get a prevalence. So how many players per week are actually affected by these injuries? So at least 25% of players every week were affected by an injury that allowed them still to keep training. So out of the whole squad that you've got, you can now sort of look at it and think that a quarter of your team are probably playing with something that they're, like, as we talk about, like as a niggle. Of course, to put some context around it, we're not talking about EPL level players. So potentially they're able to self-modify a little bit their performance. They can sit into it. But anyone who's probably worked in sport knows that there's not too far off that you see a quarter of your squad with a sore heel or a sore knee or a sore back. And that was kind of some of the other parts that were quite interesting, is that areas like the hip and groin and the lower back were the higher areas where there's a lot more non-time loss injuries reported compared to what's reported in traditional time loss injuries. So it's potential that players just continue to play with those, which when you look at some of the data around and the research around why players retire, part of that is lower back and hip and knee pain. So there's not necessarily a strong causation there, but it's something that we tend to see a bit of. And definitely in my perspective, when I'm working with teams, a lot of players have a lot more back pain that just doesn't stop them playing. They just deal with it and they just keep going, or they self-medicate. So I think it gives us another insight into the world of sport in particular. It also gives us a bit of an area potentially to make sure that we're targeting with our injury prevention practices or injury risk reduction strategies, because our philosophy should always be to reduce any discomfort and pain. So I think it sort of just gave us a bit of a bigger overview. What we also then looked at was, because we did both at the same time, we're able to look at and probably a little bit based on some of the acute chronic workload stuff that was happening at the time, was if someone reported a non-time loss injury or a minor injury, what was the likelihood of them missing a training session or developing a time loss injury within the next 7 days after that flag. So because of the nature of the survey, we couldn't isolate. So was it the players could report multiple injuries on the same week. So it's only done once a week, I should say as well. So it's not done daily. So over the week, the player is asked, over the last week, did you have any physical complaints? So they could report a back, a hamstring, ankle, all in the one report. So we didn't. Then we looked at, did you report? So then we could look at the time loss injury for the next 7 days. So most people who had a hamstring report, end up with a hamstring time loss injury, had a hamstring report within the 7 days before. So, and again, it's from my end, I'm always cautious about saying to people, look, if someone reports it, you have to do X, Y, Z. It's more, I look at these things as conversation starters, and then it starts to go into, well, you need to encourage players to report these things because, as the title says, they matter, and it gives us a way to potentially avert an issue potentially, which could go like further research may look into that, but also it just helps open that conversation with the player about, and we start to look at, are they overloaded? Is there something else going on? So what motivates a player to report something is also, that's another PhD in itself, and I think there's some people doing that at the moment. So some really good work in that space.
No, that's fascinating. I've got two questions to kind of follow up on there. I'll come to the second one in a moment. But in terms of these subjective measures of reporting niggles, how at the current time, and I appreciate it's probably a stretch to extrapolate it to say the EPL or La Liga or some of the main leagues, but how difficult do you think it is for a practitioner to find this information, the information relating to non-time loss injuries, and actually going to the head of sports science or the head coach for that matter and say, look, we need to actually consider what we're doing with this guy right now, because ultimately we know the research suggests that this could lead to something a little bit worse if we don't act. How difficult a conversation is that? Is the subjective data enough?
I think the first answer is very hard. Like, and I suppose the other answer is it depends on where you work. So that's probably what when I talk about the role of the physio within a club is that we often are seen as the panel beaters. We don't get involved until an injury happens. So one of the things we've used this information for is to actually open the door at an earlier time in a conversation. So we've now become part of the group. So things that used to be ignored about the toughness, i.e. just harden up and just run it out or just run through it. We can now say, okay, no problem, but the risk of this player is going up. And then the beauty of it is, what I've found is it then creates a conversation about what risk is. So I think, and I've done it myself, so I'm not bagging out other clinicians, but I think as physios we probably didn't understand risk very well in terms of we think, okay, so one of the findings we had was it was about 3.6 times increased risk of a time loss injury if you reported a minor niggle. The actual normal risk is 10%. So you've got if anytime you have no problem, you've got a 10% chance of having an issue within the next 7 days, which when you look at it, it's probably not far off what we see. But so you're only going up to 36% if you have a minor niggle. So there's still a fair chance nothing's going to happen to you. But what we now can have the conversation is if a player's going, I want this player to play, and you know they've got a tight hamstring, which you know is a higher chance that they're going to get a more significant injury compared to say a groin or a lower back injury. It gives us some context to have the conversation. So a lot of it is about, I think, us as clinicians knowing where we fit in with the scheme and trying to work with all the key stakeholders, the coaches, the players, the administrators, is to have those open conversations. Go, look, this is what we found. This is what we know we can do. What we really need to do is have the coaches. We need the players reporting to us. So then it's then on us to know what to do when the players report. So there's no point a player reporting to us and we just sit them down, because no player wants that to happen. So then we have to have a conversation around, all right, so what can you do or what should we do based on that information? And to be honest, we don't know. There's no research at the moment to say if you have a niggle and you do this, then that risk goes down. Most applied practitioners would probably say, if a player tells me you've got a tight hamstring and we maybe loosen the tight hamstring, then that goes fine. Or they might say, we just don't do sprinting today until the next day, then they're fine. So a lot of that paper, I guess, probably confirms what a lot of applied practitioners probably already see and may already do. And that was really interesting from my end, because it was cool to see it, what we tend to see, I guess, in the real world. But I think having those open conversations and using it's almost using the paper and using the research to have this conversation and openness. And then you can create a system to actually have these other conversations. So we might have, if a player has done a lot of activity and they're just generally sore, they're just tight, then we'll have different sessions now that are designed by the coaches and facilitated by us, or potentially the S&C or the sports scientists. They'll run a different conditioning session based upon a report from a player, because we want them right in 2 days' time. So again, it shouldn't define a decision, but it should definitely open a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that acts as a perfect segue into my second question, actually, in terms of how has the research defined or changed your practice at your club? What are you doing differently? Are you able to implement what you found?
Yes. Yeah. So in terms of, so we do a bit of work across the junior space as well, like at an A-League academy. And that was really interesting because they have a physio at every training session. So the complication you have when you start to get people reporting everything is now all of a sudden they're telling the physio. So the physio has to do something about it. And then that when we really quickly figured out, we got, okay, we can't just be sitting people out. And the first year we sort of rolled this out, we thought, oh, well, let's have a look at, we reclassified any injury that the physio changed. So if the player came and reported some severs, sort of some heel pain associated with growth, or Osgood Slatter's sort of pain, then we were taking RPEs and so just basic training load sort of metrics. And we found out we were reducing training load on average per week by 35% if a player reported these sort of injuries that allowed them to train, but a little bit, but not as much as normal. So we classified them as almost a subcategory of a time loss injury, so a medically modified injury. And so then the following year, we looked at that and went, well, that's a big cost in terms of availability and potentially learning of the player. It's also potentially that's exactly what the player needed, was like a third reduction of load for that week. But we were able to sort of really negate that loss of training load time period by actually working with the coaches and having a bit more structure, so that the player goes from, they reported something, we had a bit more communication pathway with the S&C, so they were actually able to do less, maybe acceleration, deceleration, but they're still able to maintain some good chronic, some good base high-speed running load, for instance, so longer running versus like a big change of direction. And then obviously try and put a ball in there or some football specific work too. But it's sort of, we're able to, by us being honest as well, by actually saying to the coaches, we looked at it as an opportunity to say, look, like we know we're actually costing these players a third of their time on the park, or the potential loading on the park. So what can we do to change this? And then all of a sudden the coaches were very open, and they were very receptive to the idea that they're actually going to be part of the rehab process. So you kind of building a bridge over the silos. And so we were actually able to use the research for that purpose. In seniors, it's a little bit trickier because there's different motivations coming with adults. Yep. So whether they tell you or not. But in saying that, the players who have been around the club a fair bit, I always look for an opportunity within a club scenario to let a player train when they think I'm going to rule them out, which sounds, I don't think it's unethical, but it's not a thing we sort of look for. So, and normally if someone's got a tight back or a loaded up groin, and I know what the session's going to be, we've spoken to the coach, like we'll let them have a little, if the player says, yeah, look, I think I'll be fine. And I'll go, okay. And we'll just try not to do this and just manage your way through the session. And as soon as you're able to do that, you're actually, they trust you from then on. So then if you next time something, you go, look, we've got a game coming up, just miss tonight and you'll be right for tomorrow, and then you'll be sweet. And then they go, okay, no problem. So it's sort of, it's building that rapport and that trust, and you can have a bit more confidence because of some of this research. And and obviously then you trust what you're doing with the player. There's the interesting part with the Oslo questionnaire, and then some of the work by Caroline Bowling around what athletes consider to be an injury is really interesting. So within the questionnaire, there's subcategories, and some of it's participate. Does it affect your participation? Does the injury affect your performance, volume and severity? So one of the key components that is some of this new qualitative work has been around the concept that an athlete doesn't necessarily think they're injured until it affects their performance. So we now sort of really focus our questioning around, okay, do you think you can train? And they'll often say yes. And then the next follow-up question is, do you think you'll be able to perform the way the coach wants you to, or you want to? And then if they say no or they hesitate, then we start to have a think about whether we should be letting these players continue on. So again, it's sort of bringing it all together as not an absolute, this is what you need to do, but also just that just adds a layer to our decision-making process.
No, absolutely. And it's great to see that you've actually you're developing that questionnaire, and you're taking it further to consider the athlete's perception on performance. And it sounds like there's a lot of great work going on in that space anyway, as you've referenced. But in terms of this area in general, have you got me?
Yep, gotcha. Just my dog going off.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. So in terms of the next steps for your research and the research in this area in general, where do you think it needs to go? How can we take it a step further? Do we need to take it a step further?
Yeah, I think the next, almost the follow up to that sort of niggle sort of paper would be an intervention. So if a player does flag a non-time loss injury, what do we do? Do we intervene? Like, so is it manual therapy? Is it exercise therapy? Is it and then is it load management? Is it what intervention would we look at doing? And then probably an RCT about which way you went with it. The other component we've looked at a little bit is adding. So often in club settings, we'll take RPE and duration after every training session is just adding one question to the end to that sort of survey, and to say, did you have anything during the training session that affected your performance? You could say participation, but really I think if you could get away with one question, it would be, did you have something that affected your performance? And then the subcategories of yes, to a minor extent, moderate extent, and probably not severe, because you already know that if it's severe extent, but understand that I think you can piggyback off some of this work to show, because most of it, whether you answered yes to any one of those questions, the relative risk was very similar. So if you're looking at it as a flagging system, adding it in at the end of training is a good way to get all complaints. And I think one of the things, the other avenue we want to start going down is now looking at this medically modified concept of, okay, so what as almost a subcategory of a time loss injury, because most professional clubs the players will have multiple touch points during the day, when they come in, before training, when they're getting strapped. So at some stage, someone may hear something from a player that goes, okay, don't do the crossing today. So by definition, that's a time loss injury, but very rarely will that ever get recorded as a time loss injury. So we may be just missing some of these, and not necessarily that you do anything about them, but it just gives us a bit more of a texture for what's actually happening within footballers, and especially as footballers want to play for longer. There's a lot of money involved in football now. There's no reason, and as things get better, there's no reason we won't see more 40-year-old, or try and get into the late 30s, early 40s sort of players. So I think there's multiple avenues here. It's more just a matter of again, it's going back to the foundations of the Van Mechelen sort of model, and of Carroll and Finch's work around this concept of understanding what injuries are happening and what's happening within the system, and then piggybacking off guys like Ben Klaas and Roel Barr, who are going, look, here's our different definitions, and continuing to evolve it. And I think it's a really exciting area. I think it's very dry for some people, but people just like to go, let's just do this, let's just do that. But unless you're defining what you're recording, and unless you're understanding what are you trying to reduce. So if you want to do an injury prevention program, but you don't know what you think you don't know what you're actually trying to reduce, it's pretty hard to do. So, and you don't know if you're effective. You can obviously look at things like a Nordic hamstring exercise and go, look, we know there's enough good work out there to show that it's effective in reducing injury risk, as much as some people don't like it, but there's no evidence to not do it. So I think the continuing to work on the nuances of injury surveillance is important, and to change a culture that recording injuries accurately is really important. And then probably some of our more larger scale sort of injury primary prevention strategies, like the 11+ sort of rollouts and stuff like that. I think that's where a lot of the research my research sort of avenue will head, hopefully.
No, great stuff. No, fantastic. And I couldn't have you on without asking about the acute to chronic workload ratio and the influence that has on your practice, and ultimately your general thoughts on the whole argument. It's very it polarizes a lot of people, let's say that, and I've seen some research just this week actually to kind of put another nail in the coffin of the ratio, so to speak. But what are your thoughts on the acute to chronic workload ratio? Is it something that you use at your club? Is it something that you use with the national teams?
We don't use, what's the way to put it? I think that the ratio tends to be the issue at the moment. So I think the concept of a ratio, I saw some commentary around that new paper. I've forgotten his last name, to be honest, but it looked like a really good paper, really interesting paper, around the concept of, and I saw there was a tweet actually out today which said, does good training load monitoring prevent illness, I think it was. And it's kind of like the ratio doesn't equal good training load monitoring. And I don't think, to be honest, and it's not the beauty of science is things should evolve, and as things progress and as our knowledge and in some ways as statistics caught up to sports medicine, there was some questions raised around some of the previous work, I guess. So and I've spent ages taking training loads before, doing my dashboards, working off this, looking at 1.4s, 1.5s, and at the moment, no, I don't use it as a ratio concept. But in saying that, the concept of ensuring my players are robust, that they're adequately prepared for what they're about to do. If we know we have a period of intense match congestion, so that, like what people refer now as a spike in load, that they're prepared for that. On the flip side, we know that if they've got 3 games a week and they normally play 2 games, that's going to be more risk, partly because they're just on the park for longer. But the other part too is the accumulated fatigue. So then we'll put in extra strategies, so we make sure the nutrition's good. And so we make sure all those other things. So risk mitigation strategies. And so to me, the training load argument isn't really an argument. I think in some ways, what was done with the research, not necessarily the fault of the people conducting the research, was it was taken and spun off into a direction that it maybe wasn't supposed to go. And I think part of that came from like physios like myself, not really understanding the concept of what risk means. So it's not binary. It's not you get this, then that's going to happen. And the concept of false positives. So just because you're going into 1.5, no different to just because you get a niggle, doesn't mean you're going to have a time loss injury in the next 7 days. But it's just a higher risk than if you don't. So I think, to me, it's been really an interesting process because I've learned a hell of a lot by actually digging into the research. But I think the concept of a ratio is probably not something that I don't tend to use it. And the issue is, how much time do you allocate to those things when that sports scientist who normally would do that, or an S&C or the physio, could you be doing something that's a bit more useful? And could you hang your hat that a player is going to get injured, and can you, that same thing, can I have a conversation with the coach and say he's out because he's done 1.5, or in cricket, for instance, he's bowled 60 balls today, he can't bowl more than that, otherwise he's going to spike, and someone else has gotten injured and this is the final over and the player feels fine. How do I justify that? So if a player has a niggle and their workload has gone up, maybe there is a bit more justification for it. So I think I look at that as a good thing about science, is that there's some robust arguments on both sides of it. I'm taking a very political answer, aren't I? But but I think the concept of good load management and ensuring players are adequately loaded is, I think that's where potentially us physios maybe took it, and maybe some sports scientists as well I've worked with in particular, where it's like, I just don't do anything. And it gets to that point where don't do anything and you won't get injured. Don't never play a game and you won't get hurt, which is common sense. But making sure that people are adequately prepared to do what they're going to do. I think we're almost derelict in our duty if we don't expose players to high-speed running, if we don't let them sprint. And that's probably one thing I've seen in Australia a little bit is, and maybe it is the same in Europe, where there's a lot of focus on small-sided games. So this football conditioning model, which is fine, but if you're in a semi-pro environment and maybe don't have access to a great pitch and 20 soccer balls and 20 footballs and 3 coaches to keep the intensity up, we're not hitting the range that we need to prepare players. So we have to do supplementary running. We have to do sprinting without a ball, shock horror. So it's where we time those things to do it is good. And that's where some of the conversation, like from guys like the guys at Leicester around doing sprints on the Thursday for a training set before a game. Not really that innovative, but like it's sort of shocked a bit of the people doing it, because it's like you're going to do sprints under fatigue. But then on the same time, this acute chronic workload conversation, the concept created conversations across the whole medical team, because coaches would go, hang on, what's this sweet spot thing? Or what's this stuff? And so you're having a conversation. So our job is to be educated enough and inquisitive enough to keep questioning things, and not necessarily the individuals, but and evolve work as it goes along. So 10 years ago, we didn't talk about load very much, or like it wasn't as commonplace. You still obviously, and most coaches probably do it intuitively anyway, but I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just it evolves over time.
Great answer. And I think that's probably a good place to end, Matt. So just finally, if anybody wants to find out a little bit more about you, your work, how are they best doing so? Is there a means of reaching out to you?
Yeah, I'm reason like most people would say I'm too much on Twitter, but I'm on Twitter at Figtree Physio, FIGTEE Physio, and my website's www.figtreephysio.com.au, and that's just my clinic sort of website. But yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so feel free to if anyone reach out, they've got questions, if they think my work's rubbish or good, no problems. I'm happy to have the conversation.
Good stuff. Well, thank you again for your time, Matt. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to speak to us. And yeah, for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about what we do at iMeasureU, please do head over to our website and the IMU Academy in particular. There's a lot of good stuff on there relating to inertial sensors in general, and of course how we are trying to implement IMU STEP within elite sport. Thanks for listening. We will speak to you soon.